Tony Kirby's name. I hope you enjoy the talk this evening. It's called Great Hunger, Burren, Clare, Ireland. So we'll be touching on the Burren, Clare and Ireland. It's called Great Hunger because that's a direct translation of the Gaelic on Gorta Moor. And it's called on Gorta Moor in Gaelic on Great Hunger to distinguish us from all the other famines we had between the 1740s and 1840s, because there was 30 famines in Ireland between 1740 and 1840. So academics do not use the term the famine. They say there's no such thing as the famine because there's 30 of them. This one's distinguished, it's the last one's the most devastating, and that's why it's called a Great Hunger. Does anyone know that bronze artwork, where it is in Ireland? Custom House Quay, yeah. The artist's name is Rowan Gillespie. It's from 1997. It's commissioned by Norma Smurfit, and it's they're facing towards Great Britain, and they're facing towards anyway ships out of Ireland down the Liffey there to the sea, and they've some tiny amount of belongings, and it's done in bronze, and I think it's astonishing artistically, but from a political point of view or a historical point of view, the importance lies in the fact that it's called memorialisation. It's trying to remind us of this past of ours, you know, that this extraordinary past we had and the greatest event in Irish modern history. So that's that. Second slide, please. So the Great Hunger occurred in the 19th century. So I'm going to go back one century before that just for one slide and give you the backdrop to how we got to the 1840s and the Great Hunger. In the 18th century there was revolutionary social changes in Ireland, and we got to the stage where a tiny minority owned almost all the natural resources. So about 5% of people have about 95% of the natural resources. Now, what are the natural resources? They're woodland, rivers and agricultural land. It's a highly regulated socio-economic model. It's a burgeoning food export nation, largely agricultural economy, and there's little protection from the poor from the actions of this really small minority. And one thing critically the regulation meant, amongst many other things, meant the range of foodstuffs available to the poor was very narrow. So a lot of people ask the question, how come 3 million people in northwest of Europe in the 1840s are exclusively dependent on a crop from the Andes in South America, from altitude in Peru and Bolivia? One of the reasons is that they hadn't much choice, because most of the rest of the food was being produced, and largely produced by them as tenants on the land, was exported to Great Britain and the empire beyond. And all of this structure meant that there was endemic structural poverty. By 1845 we had 3 million destitute, they're monocultural potatoes, and they're in most abject living conditions. But the backdrop to it is this was all coming from this the rise of this socio-economic model in the 1700s. That man there, that's a sketch of Bindon Blood, and he is 18th century, as he was born in 1775. He died in 1850, and his kind of HQ was Rock Forest House, and that'd be kind of on the road out from Corofin to Gort. But he was part of this Blood family, and he would have had extensive land interests in Clare come out of the period of the Great Hunger. But it's very important to say that, he wouldn't have been the kindest of landlords, and most of them were unkind, but it's very important to say that he was English by nationality. But there's two things that complicate matters a bit if you want to just view the famine through a narrow nationalistic lens. And one is, it was the O'Briens invited the Bloods into Clare in the 1600s. And he invited them in because the O'Briens wanted them, it is said, to help them quell the unruly Irish. Although some wags said the Bloods were unruly themselves. But O'Briens and others besides them, the minority Irish, they wanted the British to come over here and to learn things from them, like new agricultural techniques, town planning. And so the O'Briens and Bloods would have had common cause in Clare in the 16, 17, 1800s, and so it could perhaps be readily talked about some of the O'Briens as well. So it is largely by 1840s, most of the land is in the hand of British landlords, but there's a minority of Irish who are kind of complicit in this situation which is going to cause this Great Hunger. So we'll get back to him later on, because he's a very interesting character in the whole big story. Next one, thank you. So another thing to give us a bit of context to what happened in the 1840s is the potato. Now the potatoes from high up in altitude, and is Bolivia. I think the same family as tomato and aubergine, amongst other things. The first place made in Europe was the Canaries on the west coast of Africa. It was 1567, but arrived into Ireland as an ecological novelty in 1586, and it changed that year when the potato arrived in this country for the first time. Changed the course of Irish history. What did we eat prior to potato in Ireland? In Munster, in this area, it was white meat, so that'd be things like chicken and rabbit. And I think some of you know better than me in the past, rabbit was a huge part of the diet in the Burren and Clare. More in Leinster, be more cereals and pulses. But the reason they went to potato in at large numbers, the poor, increasingly large numbers, is it was an ecological and gastronomic wonder. It could be cultivated in hillsides, and this is, anyone recognise where this is Kill the Boy? That's a hard one. That's the, you know it well, Francis, that's the hill behind Patrick McCormick's house, Father Ted's house. Right. And you see there, it's a bit of frost or snow, and the potato beds are clearly visible at that time. And that just proves the point that potatoes can be readily grown on hills. You don't need a horse and plough. Their main enemy is not frost, is not rainwater, of which we've too much in Ireland, but it's frost, of which we don't have that much. And it's a wonder food. It's full of vitamins and minerals. And the only thing cost these people was labour, and this is the only thing they had. They had no money, but yeah, it is labour intensive, the whole thing. But they were ready for that, and it's just gradually, 1586, we got to a situation in 1700 where 3 million were on a monoculture diet of potatoes, liquid accompaniment. Sorry, that 1700 is wrong. It would have been 1700. It wouldn't have been 3 million by 1700. By 1845, it would have been 3 million of 8.5 million, kind of almost exclusively dependent on this crop. It was a rising population. The population in 1740 is about 2 million in Ireland. 100 years later, it's 8.5 million. And this is a lot of poor people, probably, procreating on the back of their faith in this wonderful ecological novelty. It's a massive demographic explosion. There's a huge amount of land reclamation, particularly in the west of Ireland. Land that was heretofore regarded as marginal could be reclaimed, and potatoes grown in it. And then intensive subdivision of land by these huge quantities of people, and then expansion into previously unsettled areas in the west, and the west of the Ireland was the place where most populous by the potato famine, most poor and most affected by it. So maybe someone like Robin or Colin can intervene at this point and explain the lazy bed very briefly. This the principle of planting potatoes. Does anyone want to?
I'll have a go at that. So the so-called lazy beds, it was a fast way of bringing grassland in particular into cultivation. Whatever manure or seaweed you had, you laid in a broad strip, and then you cut sods on either side, folded them over a grass side in, and threw a bit of earth out of the ditches that you made, so that you made these ridges with the fertilizer tucked inside, and you could plant your chits or your seed potatoes straight into the middle.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And they're pyramidal in shape, the Yerkin ridges. And of course what's happened there is that potato crop failed in 1845, and the ridges were abandoned and grass grew on them. But the ridges are clearly seen there. And the fact that they're still there would suggest that land today in 21st century is unreclaimed, like the machine hasn't gone in there. It's kind of unimproved grasslands, and that's where you see them in the west of Ireland, grasslands that haven't been improved.
Sorry, would I known it as a scavine, was it? These rivers, they turn them over, scavines.
I haven't heard that word, Sean, but interesting.
Some type of them are scavines, yeah.
Special tool to do it as well, no?
Yeah.
It's a special
the loy. And
the
the ridges and the loy remarkably have remarkable similarities to the implements and ridges they use, thousands of miles away in the southern hemisphere at thousands of feet above sea level, just the same ingenious responses. We go to the next one, please. So just a little about the living conditions of these 3 million people by 1845. So the census of 1841, 4 years before the famine broke out, had 4 classification of houses, and 4th class was the most abject living conditions. So you're talking about one single small room, invariably it's made of mud, the house, But of course, what's very interesting about the Burren Hills is they're extracting all the time local materials. Is the pre-famine settlement in the Burren is made of stone, and I'm just, this is me off the top of my head, I would argue it's quite possible that the highest surviving rate of famine era dwellings in Ireland is in the Burren Hills, because otherwise they're made of mud, and the mud does not survive, but the stone does. And there's so many examples in those hills of independent houses or relics of villages, but the Martin Fraser's scholastic discussion on this has been limited, So mostly of mud, and but some of them could be holes in the bogs or holes in the ground. In the bogs, some of them are made out of peat, kind of like peat blocks, but there was 3 million living in these conditions, and they're known kind of colloquially as the potato people. So a few things about the houses: they were dark. Why were they dark? Was they couldn't afford glass, so there's no windows. They're damp. Why are they damp? It's because if there was a chimney at all, invariably there wasn't a chimney, it would be a primitive affair, and that means it's if it's damp. Sorry, I got my lines mixed up there. Damp because the roof is thatched, and invariably it's not thatched well, and it's not kept in good repair, and that means water is dripping in a lot of the time. So it's dark, it's damp, it's smoky because a lot of times there's not a chimney, or if there is, it's a primitive affair. So now we're up at dark, damp and smoky. And finally, it's crowded because the families are big. Remarkably, in 10% of these houses, 600,000 houses, 60,000 of them had two families living in them. I just I can't really understand it myself, so there were very crowded circumstances. They would have slept on the floor, they would have slept in their clothes, their faces would be blackened from the soot, lots of flies, the odour of stable, and the women give birth to the babies in the houses. And you can imagine the living conditions. There's highly unsanitary anyway, the conditions, and very disease prone, but giving birth to the babies is extremely hazardous. And in Ennistown in 1845, the first year of the famine, about 22.5% of babies were stillborn, Then on top of that, the other things, keeping to the crowded and unhealthy conditions, very to be a unit of livestock inside. Mostly it was the pig, because the pig was the conduit paying the rent, typhus and cholera were quite widespread. On top of that, they have a harsh outdoor life, very hard manual labour. Most landlords are unkind, so they're ill-treated by them, and constantly there's a spectre of eviction, because the potato is, seasonally dependent, there was, this is highlighting the wretchedness of them. But it's very important to add on that there was lots of gaiety, colour, fun in their lives, seeing rich folk traditions, and we'll talk about them a bit later on. So a lot of gaiety in lives, a lot of wretchedness, and a lot of solidarity, which is hard for a postmodern mind to understand today. The bottom dollar in Ireland, those 3 million people in 1845, they had this huge sense of solidarity. For example, many vagrants roaming the countryside, their culture would be to admit that person for a night's sleep, even though their conditions are abject and they are risking social diseases. Widow women who couldn't look after the land themselves, the younger men would come to their house on Sunday, their day off, and they do their potato plot for them. So there's wretchedness, but there is gaiety and there is a lot of solidarity as well. Next one, please. So a little bit about the folk traditions of these people, and they were very rich folk traditions. The dance tradition was a richly expressive vernacular art form. Close encounters in unregulated spaces, which is not really the dance tradition in Ireland today, with men and women largely kind of distances apart. Battering on the floor, that was done by the men and was considered transgressive. And it's all a bit, flamboyant theatricality. The wigs, again, faces blackened. Transvestism, as in men wearing women's clothes on occasion. Games would play dance, song and music. Waking the dead, and of course carnivalesque behaviour, which I think is a nice adjective to describe the rowdy dow later in the evening, And then, the keening at funerals and wakes were massive social occasions, and there were occasions of expression of their religion, which was in itself kind of interesting, their religious identity. But yourselves, the keening was wild, it was mournful, and the women were the arbiters of the grief, and had this Gothic excess to it. Interesting, that's being revived in art form now in Ireland with certain singers and bands. It's great to see it's in a revival form as an art form as opposed to an expression of grief at funerals. Belief in fairies, and belief in fairies is a deeply rooted part of the folk beliefs. And Ireland is an outlier in Europe in that we've belief in fairies. Belief in fairies was all over Europe in its time, but in Ireland's an outlier in that there's belief in fairies in living memory, and a deep rooted belief, and a lot of things in their lives, like health and livestock and home and fortune, which we understand today through science possibly, they understood a lot of it through the fairies. And for example, the building of those houses, one of the things they would do is they put down 4 blocks at the 4 corners, bottom stones of the house, come back the next day, and if the blocks were gone, they wouldn't build a house because the fairies, they would have believed, had taken the blocks because they were building on a fairy thoroughfare or a fairy assembly site, equivalent of a 21st century planning permission, I suppose. They believed that in the houses that when they went to sleep, the ancestors and the spirits of the ancestors and fairies would congregate around the fire in these very primitive houses, and they had a ritual pertaining to putting on the fire at night, putting on the fire in the morning, putting it out in the evening. So fairy belief was a huge thing in their life. These spirits living in a parallel, invisible world, and this is part of their religion, So these people are the anchorage of these folk traditions, these 3 million deaths do it, and it's all through the medium of the Gaelic language. Very important to understand that prior to the famine in Ireland, 60% of the people were mother tongue Gaelic, another 20% were fluent Irish speakers. By the end of this century, the same century, the language is on the verge of extinction. There's a couple of reasons besides, but obviously if these 3 million, which are the all native Gaelic speakers, are taken out through immigration and death, it's a body blow from the language which arguably we're only recovering from now in the 21st century. At this moment the language seems to be of going through a mild revival. So the next one please. Just a little bit about their religion before we get to the main event. I think rather than jumping into that, just explain who these people were in terms of their traditions, beliefs, daily lives and that. It wasn't, it was kind of like, 1845 in Ireland, the Roman Catholic Church has been suppressed for a couple of centuries. Now in 1825, it's 24 years before, or 20 years before the first year of the famine, they get this Roman Catholic emancipation. And finally the church gets back to being allowed to build churches and express their religion communally in public places. But it is a gradual affair, this kind of a reinvigoration. So in a couple of hundred years, when the church was outlawed, the question is, what was the religion of the people? And the answer is, it was to an extent official Catholicism, but it was mixed with other things like home-based spirituality. There's not many priests, there's not many churches, so what do they do? Their religion is a mix of a la carte Catholicism. They do cling to some things of Catholicism, but otherwise they've bonfires, they've wakes, they've use of protective charms, high points in the agricultural year, like the 4 big agricultural festivals, Imbolg, Bealtaine, Lunasa and Samhain, holy wells, pattern days. It's a tenacious hold of pre-Christian traditions, and so much so that in the 1830s the mass attendance in Ireland right now is only 30%, which is very hard for a lot of us to understand now in the 21st century, even though mass attendance in Ireland is going down now. But a lot of us here in the room in living memory remember when mass attendance in Ireland in our lifetime was up at around 90%, but it was only about 30% in the 1830s because these 3 million people, they didn't consider mass going as part of their duties regarding Roman Catholicism. So what did they cling to in Roman Catholicism? 3 things: birth, marriage and extreme unction, death. They were the 3 things that they adhered to, believed strongly in and officially interpreted it, So this is a great sketch by George Petrie. He was a great painter, musician, antiquarian, archaeologist, very important man in documenting folk traditions in Ireland through those media in the 1800s. And this is a sketch from St. Bridget's Holy Well in the Scanner, which is interesting because That's the stream. Now he's probably taking an artistic license, but it's kind of there's a canopy over the stream now today, of course, and that's what it may have been like more in the past. And these are the people here kind of revering around the holy well. And the thing about St. Bridget's and Liscannor was, in those times, it was that exact mix that I just told you. It was a mix of official Catholicism, you know, the night before the patron day, there would be there would be a vigil, be prayer, be a lot of singing. Ireland Islanders would be coming over, their distinctive clothes. It was a maritime pilgrimage essentially, but like there was a market attached to it that would be at Lahinch, and you would have had the horse racing on the beach at Lahinch as well. It was kind of a 2-day festival, so a pattern day of regional significance in the west of Ireland, and it was a real mix of official Catholicism. There would be mass said by priests, but then there was the unofficial Catholicism, like the Holy Well tradition itself, which has elements in it, as you all know, which are very much not in concert with Christianity, official Christianity, like revering trees and water and stone for religious purposes. So that's a little about that. Am I speaking too fast? No. Okay. I get excited. You know? Thanks. What's your first name?
The horse race.
Sorry?
Brendan.
Brendan, thank you.
The horse race was down in the last one.
Yeah. The horse races in the Hinch.
Yes.
Yeah. So, a fungus attacks the potato. It attacks it in damp, muggy conditions. It's called blight in English. And the important thing to say about it is that this fungus did not just attack the potato in Ireland. It attacked the potato in all of the north of the continent of Europe. And the second thing to explain about it is, where did that fungus come from? And it came from the United States of America. And it was lined from Philadelphia to New York. And it was potato seeds. And it been brought into Belgium for field trials. So this is international trade, like is the background to this. And the seeds, some of the commodity ships, had the fungus, and the fungus spread right across the north of Europe for those 6 pestilential years. So in the Netherlands, 50,000 people died as a result of their potato failure, but in Ireland it was 1 million, and died, and 2 million emigrated. So there's obviously kind of something going on in Ireland about it that's not going on in the Netherlands, and probably people in the Netherlands had more access to food than the poor Irish had. They weren't kind of hadn't a more regulated socioeconomic we already had. And secondly, the government intervention to address the blight was probably more vigorous than it was in Ireland. But we'll talk about government intervention in a while. You know, today in Ireland, one could argue, looking back at that event in the 1840s, and some scholars would argue, there amongst us, this is not my argument now, but the argument of a number of scholars, that there's silence, shame and controversy amongst us today on the Great Hunger of 1845-1849. And the silence of the 1 million who died, because their testimony is the most important, but they are mute. The shame is, you know, some people saying the past was a different country. It was famine, trauma, war, just look forward from now. And the controversy, no question, is there. And the controversies between those, and this is between intellectuals in Ireland as well today, amongst them the intellectual community, about the causes of the famine. And there are those who say it was an entirely natural event. 3 million on monoculture died with potatoes. The potato crop wanes. 1 million died, 2 million emigrate, and it's like a blame-free approach to humanitarian catastrophe. But there are those who argued that the famine was a human construct, that the food was exported in huge quantities as the people died. And that thing about the food being exported in huge quantities is scientifically true, because in 1845, 26 million bushels of grain were exported from Ireland. In 1847, 4,000 vessels of food from Ireland to England, 9,992 calves, 822,681 gallons of butter. And in a statistic it really kind of, I couldn't believe really was, 1.3 million gallons of grain-derived alcohol was exported from Ireland to Great Britain in 1847, the worst year of the famine. So that's 1.3 million gallons of grain-derived alcohol. If that grain had not been made into alcohol for vodka, whiskey and gin in Great Britain, quite a lot of lives would been saved. But you're talking about 100,000 sterling value of food being exported each month. So if we do accept the scholars who say that the famine was an artificial human construct, not a natural event, you've got to ask these scholars to back up their argument. And they say the following: the three reasons why, you say to scholars, God, geez, how could anyone export food when people are dying from lack of it? And these are, remember, the country's called the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Ireland, so these people dying are subjects of Westminster. And how could you allow these people to die while you continue to export food and deny them access to it? Well, these same scholars who have this point of view say there are three reasons why the British government in London made this choice of continuing to export food while the people are dying from lack of it and emigrating as well. And one was they were ideologically wedded to the neoclassical economic model, which says you cannot interfere with the market, laissez-faire. The second reason is providentialism, that with their Victorian mindset, they believed that the famine was an act of God. So they're I feel like it's kind of almost outsourcing the blame, and it's an idea kind of that good things might happen after the bad things, and even some of the more zealous, like Trevelyan said, it's a corrective thing on the the indolent, wayward Irish. And the third thing is a word called stadialism, which I heard Kevin Whelan, the historical geographer, heard him give a lecture on this once, and I took down notes, and that was in it. And I lost the word for about 25 years. And I found it in my notes the other day. It says, I'm going to show about this crowd, stadialism, But I had to look it up again to find out what it meant. And it means that there are stages of civilization, that certain races, or maybe us all, go through stages of civilization. And the Irish, according to the British elite at the time, were going from savagery to civilization. And this was one stage on their path towards civilization. Trevelyan, he was the chief famine administrator. He was under Secretary of Treasury in London. He was the line manager for the famine. He said the judgment of God sent calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. So there's your divine providence, and there's your kind of his kind of a regard for the people. I believe he said about when the potato failed in the Scottish Highlands, he said the famine cannot take hold here. So it's kind of like, it's kind of a very racialist, this kind of thing of, what destiny this crowd will get and what this will get. But he, as one of the line managers in deciding these things, which had enormous implications for people in terms of death, starvation, emigration, and so on. He got knighted in 1847 for his work in Ireland during the potato famine. His great granddaughter worked with the BBC, and she left her post in the BBC and she set up a Trevelyan Foundation to make reparations, because after Ireland he went to maybe the West Indies, but he certainly indulged in slavery. And she, I forget her first name, has quite well endowed financially and a trust, and they're making reparations. And Dermot Ferreter, the excellent historian, had said of the Trevelyans, they thought of making reparations to the Irish just the last 10 years for the misdoings during the famine. And Ferreter said, well, Jesus, don't give us any money, but one thing the Trevelyans could do is they could press the British government to make Irish history, a greater part of the education in Great Britain, more British people. I know a lot of British people that don't know of this, and anyone that talked about it is kind of like pretty horrified that this was done by their government at that time, Thanks, Brendan. So, what I'd like to do now is, the famine, obviously this thing is an enormous, vast story. It's kind of the biggest event in Irish modern history, the biggest humanitarian catastrophe in peacetime in the story of the world then, since the Black Death in the 1300s. It happened in the richest, most powerful country in the world then, called the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Ireland. So the sheer scale of it means, like, for example, there haven't been many feature films on it. I know about 2, I think, in total. But it's just the sheer vastness of it is one of the reasons why there hasn't been that many, perhaps. So what I'd like to do now is to get away from the vastness and get into something really kind of like almost microgeography, get into one place in particular to get an idea of how you can get a sense of the thing, the macro from the micro. And this is in the parish of Glenina. So it's when I talk about parish, it's a civil parishes. It's Ballyvaughan is the main village, northwest of the Burren, incredibly scenic, and real estate is very expensive there now, which is kind of an irony because there was so much poverty there then in that time. So there's seven townlands in the parish, and just to give you the idea how inegalitarian things were at the time. 5 of them were owned by Bind Blood, and that's the man we showed a sketch of earlier on, that lived in Rock Forest House. And the Bloods were significant landowners, not just in North Clare, but getting into Mid Clare as well. And 2 of the townlands were owned by Francis McNamara, and he would have been, maybe some of you might help me this, was it Ennis Diamond House, was it?
The Falls, what's the
Falls,
Falls today?
Yeah, Falls today. Yeah, thanks. So it's owned by just the 2 of them. And there was 146 houses in the parish, and this is a remarkable statistic. 90.4% of them were fourth classification. This means effectively ramshackle, primeval, miserable hovels. And to give you an idea of how remarkable that destitution is in that particular parish at a national level, I'm just going to roll out some numbers here. Nationally, in 1841, 37% of the houses, in the sense of 1841, 37% of the houses in Ireland were fourth classification, just 37%. County Clare, it was 51%. And of course, County Clare is the county, apart from Mayo, that was most affected by the famine in terms of death and immigration, and that's because the profile of the people is, 51% are, destitute. In the barony, now we've gone from nationally to County Clare, now we're in the Burren barony, before we get to the townland of Glenina. In the Burren barony, 69.6% of the houses in the Burren barony are fourth classification. And then you get to Glenina parish. So you've gone from county, you've gone from nation to county to barony, and now you're at the realm of the smallest geographical unit in Ireland, townland. 90.4% of the houses in Glenina parish in 1841 are fourth classification. There's no question, this is a national epicentre of famine suffering. In one village in particular, the map isn't very distinct. So, if I can see it there, yeah, it isn't very good, the map, sorry. But here, yeah, you might be able to see, but I'll point them out to you anyway. Houses here, there's a lot of dots, black dots, and that's Craig Village, and there's remnants of it today. And there's 220 people in that village alone. And to give you an idea of the population of Ballyvaughan, which is only a few miles north there at the time, was about the same. But the difference between Ballyvaughan and these famine villages, Ballyvaughan would have been a service village, so there's public services like post office, amongst other things. It's got private centres. These famine villages, such as they were, would have had no services whatsoever, and they lived in a communal way of dividing up farmland, and they're almost always situated in the Burren on the green land just before you go onto the rocky land, which makes perfect sense, because if you think of the green land, the valley floors, it's off limits, and that's all the commercial farming, really good land, although a lot of them might be tenants or landless labourers working there. So they're pushed as far away from there as possible to the El Dorado part, if you like, and they can't live up on the rock because there's not enough soil there. So they live just right on the apron of the where we found at the apron between the green land and the rocky land. You can see there that the parish, the decrease in population in 30 years there was 80%, so a staggering decrease in population, and that's divided amongst those who were died and those who emigrated. So no question, an epicentre of famine suffering nationally. Now the villages there, but over here you have some of you might know it as Glenina Castle. It's a tower house, and in there it's written there there's Glenina Lodge. The Glenina Lodge would be known by Bind and Blood, the person we saw earlier. with his 5 townlands here. This one is the townlands, and it would have had buildings there, significant buildings, and it would have had botanical gardens, and even the castle itself he had covered and used as a barn for cattle. And this is just one kind of fraction of his real estate. And so you've got it's a fabulous place to view the rich man, poor man thing of, the Glenina Lodge, which is kind of a maritime retreat of years, while here you have the chaos here of the suffering only like hundreds of yards away. Somewhere here, I think there's along the road, just here, there is what's called a pinnacle well. You might go on, Brendan, actually. Yeah, so this is just along the road a few hundred yards from that village. It's in Glenina North still, we're still there. And yeah, Bindon Blood, he dies in 1855. Now, the Dublin Evening Mail described him as a kind and considerate landlord. But the Dublin Evening Mail, so it was here in Ireland in 1962, and then the Evening Herald, Evening Press just outcompeted it, but remarkably so. But the Dublin Evening Herald was conservative, capital C, and very much pro-landlord. So, in fact, in some Kilkeedy publication, he was described as anything but by local people in Kilkeedy. So I think that's kind of ideologically charged, the description in the Dublin Evening Mail. And if 88% drop in population in 30 years in that part of his domain would not suggest kindness and consideration. So around, just I'll hold it there for a sec before I talk about the monument. Just to say, when I was researching this, I found out that William Blood, his son, who's, Bindon Blood, this is Bindon, but his son is called William Bindon Blood. So Blood dies in 1855, but what happens is that, this is just by the way a little, the son William goes to Edinburgh and he studies engineering there. And his father, Bindon Blood, with his extensive properties in Clare, with his headquarters in Rockford's house, what does he do? He goes over to live in Edinburgh. And he buys a house, 22, William Street? Can't think of it. But it's one of the first 3 houses in the new town in Edinburgh. I'm actually going to Edinburgh over the next few days. I'm doing a guided walking tour of the old town. But that street that he bought the house in 22, still there, the street. I'm going to look at the house now, the house. And there were gardens there. Beautiful private gardens they enjoyed. And you think of this, the lavishness of this wealth. He's in another country now, and he's got this, fabulous real estate there. And all the while back in Ireland, there's, mayhem and all that. What he does then over in Edinburgh is he advertises lands to rent in Ireland, and from Rock Forest House included. But I don't think there was much uptake on it. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. The son William then, so he dies in 1855, and the son William comes back to Ireland, and he gets a post in teaching, professor of engineering in Galway. So I reckon that it's essentially there, it's a natural cutting spring, a roadside coming from the mountains, comes up in the form of a spring there, and there was just a spring of water coming out until the 1860s, and then the Bloods obviously commissioned the building of this Gothic number as a canopy for the well. But it's remarkable the context was built in. It's 1860s. What did we say? Between the 1840s and 1870s, 80% of people in this area die or emigrate. Whilst all this is going on, the Bloods are building themselves what's essentially a folly. It's little practical purpose in an exuberant architectural style, like kind of Gothic excess. And of course, what's fascinating is the contrast between the lavishness of this architectural style and the ramshackle cabins of their tenants. It's quite remarkable as a monument, as a telltale of the history of those times. It's called Tubbercornin, but I think there's only one reference ever to it being a holy well, and it's really debatable whether it's a holy well at all in the first place. That's again by the way. But what you're seeing now, Adam, is that people are tying ribbons to the hawthorn behind and leaving devotion alien side, and this seems to be propagated largely by mass tourism, it being on the wide Atlantic Way in some guides and driver guides like me essentially, like, you know, spin the yarn to the people, and make a wish, like, you know, it's a holy well, kind of all that kind of stuff. And local people are very zealous, a local community group, about trying to stop that kind of you know, kind of stuff, which I think is good that they're doing that. So it can be interpreted on many levels, that number, but it's a monument to the unfairness of life. One of the epicentres nationally found at times. I only saw now there's a bicycle there, and the reason is that William Big in Blood, that's the son. He was said to be Ireland's first cyclist. You know, there's a little historical film in this, but as the fellow says, I'm not going to do it. You know, about these people, like, you know. But and he loved cycling, and the security forces asked him, like, you know, to stop cycling because there had been 3 assassination attempts on him, like, you know. So anyway, a bit of colourful kind of family history, but I thought that's a bit of a, I didn't place it there, I swear. So anyway, that's a bit of microgeography, and, you know, it's just as well, because such a vast thing, you get a real sense of why, when, where, how, when you go into a kind of little area like that, like Clonina parish, that of 9 townlands, and things begins to make a bit of sense. So, in famine, it's a cruel thing to say, it's an awful thing to say about famine, but in all famines in the world, there are losers and winners. And we've talked all night about the losers, but what of the winners? Well, one of the winners was the Roman Catholic Church. And we may have a slide on it in a while. I'm losing faith in my slides at this stage, but I think we have. And one of the simple reasons why the church did so well out of the famine was 3 million emigrated, and these were largely not mass going, and they weren't rigidly adherent to Roman Catholicism. But at the same time, pre-famine and post, more so, the Roman Catholic Church is getting more richer and more powerful, and vocations are soaring, so the ratio of priests to people is turning in the opposite direction, and they spot an opportunity for them. I think we will talk about it a little later on. The gentry, of which the gentry is very small, includes bloods and a small Irish gentry as well. These people who were mostly unkind during the famine, they do well out of it. The land is cleared. In the 1850s in Ireland, the decade after the famine, 240,000 people were cleared from the land, you know, and that means a thing called hut tumbling, like, you know, just tumble their huts. They got to get off the land, like, you know, and of course the land has been intensified for farm purposes. Gentry doing well out of that. Cattlemen, graziers, dairymen, essentially a lot of these were the Irish middle class now, rising Irish middle class, they do well out of it, and merchants, traders and speculators. And the speculators did well out of it because in 1849 the British government brought in a thing called the Encumbered Estates Board. Now what's happening there is that, and if stop me if you've heard this one before, wait till you hear this, a lot of properties were distressed. Property crash. So the state decides to assume the property in a public purse and sell it at haircut prices. You've never heard that before. It was the equivalent of NAMA of its day. So the speculators going wild in this stuff. Like, there's properties, they're going bankrupt. A lot of the reason going bankrupt, some of them is because of the starvation. The yellow pack labour is going, and that means you can't pay the mortgage in your estate. And so like the British government moves and starts selling these at haircut prices. And the reason I mention that is as follows. That's an aerial view of Abbey Trowery graveyard in Skibbereen. And here, this kind of square here, these are known as the pits, and that's what they would have been buried in. A lot of people don't call the pits. Don't know the word in Irish, would have been a word in Irish. But it was described, the pits here in this graveyard were described by a doctor down there, Dr. Dan Donovan, as a battlefield, a pyramid of coffins piled on each other, naked corpses protruding from the ground. Even as late as 1849, this is just near Skibbereen town, 100 people being buried a week in the pits. And the reason why I told you that is because, you know, it's personal to me. My family, on my mother's side, were winners from the famine. Because I've gone into the genealogy of my mother's side of the family. I hope to get around to my father sometime this year. And what I've learned is my mother died about 6-7 years ago, 98 years of age. her mother, my grandmother, Leahy, Kathleen Leahy, I was 5 years of age when she died, so I did meet her, but I don't have any memories of her. But Kathleen Leahy was from a townland called Burren in Clare, which is it's about 8 or 9 kilometres from this graveyard. Skibbereen in general area was an epicentre of national famine suffering. And when I was doing the genealogy with the genealogist at the Skibbereen Heritage Centre, Margaret Murphy, across the table from her, she said Drumacora. And I said, sorry, I've got to back up a minute here. My understanding was that my family, the Leahys, were from Goran. And she said, in 1849, your family acquired a second estate. You know, so we were winners from the family, inverted commas, like, you know. So that's that. But just go on to the next one, please. Oh God, like, brilliant, isn't it? It's a blank. Go back to that. Okay, I'll do my best on this. So sorry about this. That's St. John the Baptist Church in Ballyvaughan, built around 1875. And so many of our churches in the Republic of Ireland are from the second half of the 1800s. You'll see if I have any notes on this, but otherwise I'll do my best. Get by somehow. Okay, so what happens, I say, is that the church is getting more powerful. It's getting richer. There's an explosion of church building. You know, most of the churches we have in Ireland today are from the second half of the 1800s. The vocations are soaring as well, for priests and for nuns also. There's a huge rise in building of cathedrals as well. And what happened in this period also is 1850, 1875, apart from the vocations rising, the churches and cathedrals soaring in number, is that the church conducts what's called a devotional revolution. Has anyone ever heard of the phrase? No. It's remarkable because I think it's an amazing term. It was coined by a late great Irish-American academic called Emmett Larkin. That's what he coined this. This thing happened, it's like the Celtic Tiger thing. It happened, but just some give the name. But he gave it this name in about 30 years ago, and it's stuck. But it's a great name for it. So in 1850, 1875, the church says there's a vacuum here. With these 3 million going, there's a vacuum in national identity. So we will populate that vacuum with what we imagine the Irish nation should be. And they imagine the Irish nation should be that Roman Catholicism be unbiddably linked with nationhood, with the state. So like when we get to 1922, obviously it all comes together, as in the church and the state kind of ruling the country together for until living memory. But so what they do to say is, well, these 3 million are gone. They weren't really strict adherent. Our numbers are rising. But also said that they went on a kind of cultural crusade and said these folk traditions, which are dying, but we've got to do something about them because they're not in concert with it, or idea of Roman Catholicism. So things that were being enfeebled because of the disappearance of these people were enfeebled more because the church said these things are just not part of the plan. So the dance tradition, it said, didn't like the close proximity of men and women, didn't like the battering on the floor by the men, and new dance traditions were invented. Like, is it the Walls of Limerick, Siege of Venice? I always get them wrong. And you can see the proximity goes then, the caning tradition was considered to be kind of transgressive, and that too was culturally kind of cleansed, if you like, to an extent. The other things were the wake tradition was really kind of like, you can see how the church would regard it as being really uncomfortable, the idea of waking the dead and all the other things that I said beside. And the wake tradition survives in Ireland today, but not in the form it was then. And so on, so there's cultural carnage, absolute cultural carnage, with the disappearance of these folk traditions, provoked by two things: the mass deaths, the mass immigrations, but also a hugely significant event called Devotional Revolution, which was highly successful as we know today, you know. So that was that. Just a couple of things to finish up, just two more slides. The archaeology of the famine. There's not much archaeological excavation of famine dwellings, and it's only my theory, and my theory is as follows. One is because archaeologists in general might regard them as not really having much to find because these people hadn't much, and are very not going to find bones, which is a big thing probably archaeologists are after in terms of dating. But also there's things like archaeologists like the rest of us, they follow market forces. And a lot of archaeological work in Ireland today is following the trail. The trail is, a lot of it is kind of when a stage of huge infrastructure developments, and you know, when big developments get going and they go down on the ground, you find archaeology. And according to the law in Ireland, they have to be excavated. Now, there might be just the infrastructure project goes on, the site is left, but it has to be excavated, scientifically excavated, and that's where a lot of the money is today. So, for market forces and probably perception that these won't turn up a lot, it's very uncommon, and it's a pity really. But to give you an idea, County Clare's been limited to 3 excavations ever, and one of them was at the famine village of Lis-on-Rue in Ballyvaughan 2010 by Dr. Maggie Ronayne of University College Galway, an exciting community archaeology programme. The report was never published, and I think that was due to, but only off the top of my head thinking, cuts in NUI Galway, you know, just kind of financial cuts. Be great eventually if this report comes out. The second was in 2022, and that was in Derryboyne, Crusheen, and they found what is TVAS, an archaeological firm, good archaeological firm, and they found only one thing, and it was the fragments of a child's ankle-high boot in the fabric of the building. And it was such a sensational find because there's only been 3 such found ever in Ireland. You know, footwear of children in fabric of houses. There's been 2,000 found across cultures and civilizations in the world, and they're always kind of vernacular houses of poor people. And it's always the same reason they're put there by these people in the past, because the belief was if you put the fragment of a shoe of the infant in the fabric of the building, it would ward away evil spirits. Another insight into their folk traditions, you know. So that was quite an exciting find, and that was 2022. Last one, Brendan. Second last, actually. The 2025, there has been in May of this year an excavation of a famine era dwelling in Karen. The town is called Fahy North. It's a standalone famine era 4-class house. It's fascinating in its own right before we go any further and talk about the excavation, because here, that actually is a deer park boundary wall. So in here you had a deer park belonged to the Bloods. So our friend Bindon Blood, he wouldn't have actually. Deer parks in Ireland and Britain largely got dismantled around 1750. So the high point of deer hunting in enclosed spaces amongst the elite in Great Britain and Ireland was 1600, 1750. And it's always interesting to look where the deer parks are, and the name deer parks of townland. And in North Clare there was only 2 deer parks. And one was the deer park of the O'Briens, which is in the townland of Deer Park north of Lemony, and the other was owned by the Bloods. So you get, you know, this community of the well-got is very tight in the end. So let's presume around 17. The reason why deer parks got dismantled and largely went to farming around 1750 was, you know, this small aristocracy of Britain loved deer hunting. They adored it. They adored the chase. They fraternised with their fellow gentry, lodged nearby, you know, and then they sit down to defend. It's a central thing in their social cultural lives, the deer park and deer hunting. But around 1750 got too expensive to maintain, and it was dismantled largely went to farmland, which the 2 deer parks that I mentioned are today. And but didn't stop them hunting. They liked it so much. What do you do? Fox hunting in the open, like, you know. There's a funny aside to that is that the hounds were fast enough to catch the deer in the enclosed space, but they weren't fast enough to catch the fox in the open countryside. So they had to, you know, breed them for stamina and speed to turn into the fast chase it is now. So to get to the point, that's one of the walls. This is a gable wall of the house. That's another one. It But this one is actually a deer park boundary wall. So in other words, the Bloods evidently said to tenants of theirs around 1750s, dismantling Deer Park, we don't need the wall to be as high it used to be for to contain deer. So you take stone from the house, stone from the Deer Park wall to build your house. So all these three sections here are from the Deer Park wall. This is the Deer Park wall, they've added a V stone on top of it. So it's got a very similar story, the house, before we go any further, because it's a ramshackle primeval dwelling of a poor family, but the materials used to build the house come from the estate of the elite from the Deer Park. It's a very interesting story, that. So, May 22, what happened was, regarding this house, myself and a friend called Nick G.E.H., we were kind of concerned about the house because, as a lot of you know, hazel is a beautiful native tree, but it's an enemy of archaeology. And it was growing, quite assertively outside, but even it was beginning to grow in the house itself. And we said, like, if something is done about this, it's going to be included for future generations. So we approached Burren in November of last year, 24, and asked them would they consider it as one of their monthly Burren conservation volunteer activities, just target removal of scrub within and outside the house. They approached the landowner, and he's very happy to give permission. There had to be a licensed archaeologist on site to make sure that the building was compromised. That was Elaine Lynch, some of you know her because she's a great archaeologist, the daughter of Michael and Clodagh, and Burren volunteers. And so that was the removal of the scrub. That was November 24. May 20, after we got back to the cars, November 24 after it, and Elaine is her expert area is prehistoric archaeology. She said rather excitedly, I'm going to excavate the house. What? And she said, yeah, I'm going to look for a license next time. She got it on May 25, a 4-day excavation. Elaine and Burren volunteers didn't expect to find much, but they found, now I won't go into all they found, but they found broken tableware. This is kind of like, nice ceramic painting on it. Cups, plates, saucers. They found metal things like iron, scissors, hammer and sickle. And the other thing I've just mentioned, clay pipes, we found other things as well. But the finding of the broken tableware, it was like, you do not associate this tableware of a medium quality with a destitute family. And you do not associate a destitute family with these everyday implements as well. So it is a bit perplexing. All of these things are going for examination, have been examined at the moment by experts. But one possibility is, in terms of those finds there, is that a minority of these family era dwellings were used seasonally by labourers. But the other possibility is that it's definitely a family era dwelling, because on the maps of 1820s, is it that one family occupied up to the famine and evacuated, and some other family after that, they came in and were maybe post-famine or prosperous. I don't know the answer to that. I've tried to find out the name of the family who lived there, which I think is the most important thing of all, because one could argue the family era dwelling is the cornerstone of our heritage and Irish modern history. The family lived in that, ups and downs, ebbs and flows of daily lives, and it was a tumultuous event in our modern history. So it's nice to give them their name back, Some of you know Paddy Hines is 97 years of age, and Paddy's a remarkable memory of the past, going back a long way, and asked Paddy, and unfortunately Paddy couldn't remember the name of the family there, but we're not going to give up, 2 clay pipes, and they were both broken. Now, clay pipe smoking was not just, this is pre-nicotine 20th century, so would have been smoke tobacco before that. It's through pipes. Now, I would presume the wooden ones are more expensive, because clay pipes, you can mass produce them in kilns. And clay pipe smoking was an individual pastime of these poor people, but also was an integral thing in their social and cultural lives. Weddings and funerals were huge social occasions for them, and clay pipe smoking was an integral part of that. At funerals and wakes, I should say, you have had whiskey, Guinness, snuff, and trays of clay pipes given out to the people. And if a person got a clay pipe to do deed, they said Lord of Mercy. And clay pipes became known as Lord of Mercies. They would infuse often Guinness and whiskey into the mouth of it, it's a nice fragrance from it, like, you know. This is way off my area of expertise now, so, but that's what they say. You know, so they're an integral part of their so culturalised. You know, you might find around the houses that's kind of like, you know, the pastime itself broken. Why? Well, they like them long stem because that means that smoke and the heat is further from the house and maybe they more readily break. But you find them in graveyards as well, because graveyards were managed by the minority Church of Ireland community. So Roman Catholic service was prohibited at it. So what did they do? They break the pipes and throw them on and hit the coffin, like, you know. So that's why they're there. Now the two clay pipes tend to have writing on them, and one had tally-ho written on them. Nothing got to do with the hunt that preceded it, but tally-ho is a brand of clay pipe. But the other one, quite interestingly, had written on it, God Save Ireland. And that's very interesting because, you know, Erin go brawl, literally Ireland till doomsday. This is probably post-famine. I must find out this is a catch cry. But it is kind of, yeah, like the independence movement in Ireland post-famine. We're on a historic march perhaps towards independence from Great Britain, and God Save Ireland is the catch cry. So that might be an insight into their political sympathies. And that's that, you know. Had anyone heard of that excavation? No. No, you had you? Yeah.
I went down to look at it while it was on, actually.
Did you?
I've
Yeah.
been down
Yeah.
there.
Was it hot, was it?
It was hot, actually.
Yeah,
I remember that
because
very
I went down once or twice and they said, this was your idea. They were all on the floor in the dirt and it baking hot, and I was there just going, you know, so this was your bloody idea in the first place, you know. Where are you? What's your first name?
Graham.
Are you involved in Burren BO, yeah?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a member. I've done a few of the scope clearances. And
Yeah,
the
great.
two digs Elaine did at Novel.
Yeah,
the last couple of years.
fantastic. And Elaine said she might next year go back to excavating one or two more famine dwellings, which would be, I say, you know, the Burren is probably in Ireland has the highest surviving amount of famine era dwellings because of the stone in the hills there, and yet studies and excavations are very slim so far. So the last slide, Brendan, please. So we came in with Rowan Gillespie, Custom House Quay, and their bronze statues of desperate people and are getting out. And here we're closing out with, this is the waterfront in Toronto. I've never been there, but it's meant to be a really beautiful waterfront in that city. And this is them coming in because Rona, you know, was asked for those who were coming into Canada to put something at the other side of the Atlantic to show what they'd be like. He showed what they were like on the way out. Now he shows them where they come in, and you know, I see this one here is expecting and looking to the heavens and desperate going out, desperate landing into what they hope will be a new life. You know, the last thing I'll just say is like the 1995 was the 150th anniversary of the first year of the famine. It was a fabulous year. Some of you might remember, great outpouring of community, artistic, scholastic events to commemorate the famine. And you know, one could argue the most important thing of all about the famine is to remember it and to learn from it, you know. And commemoration, that's if it's talks, if it's walks, if it's books, if it's films, if it's exhibition centres, we really need to learn a bit more about our past. You know, Christine Kennelly, she's director of the Great Hunger Institute in Quinnipiac University in Connecticut. She says, a country's not a country without remembering its past. Without it, we've no present and no future. And the great Professor Luke O'Neill said, we're refusing to see the past as over and done with, especially the past of victims of history. Commemoration becomes radical memory, not a consolation for things past, nor an exercise in futile nostalgia. And of course, like many things, you know, it shaped our modern nation, the famine, in terms of, you know, linguistically, we're mother tongue English speakers today, largely because of it. We're one of the most underpopulated countries on earth, which is very unusual given that the population of planet Earth has increased sevenfold since the beginning of famine. We're our highest population decided since then, 6.1 million, I think, but 25% less. So that's a big thing in terms of our demographics, our language, and much more besides as well. But that's the last thing I would take from it, that you know, that the crucial thing is try to remember. And if we remember, we can remember as well that some of the choices made at that time perhaps were wrong, And that informs us how deep we deal with famine today. Perhaps we could learn from the Irish potato famine that famine is not natural ever, ever, ever. It's a human construct. And famine today is going on in places like Sudan, Haiti, Mali, Gaza. And the one thing we can learn from a bit of famine in Ireland, one of the great lessons from it is that famine is entirely unnecessary in a world of plenty, and it's always a human artificial construct, So hope you enjoyed it.
Well done.
Thanks, Brendan.
Tony, I've just got an observation
Yeah.
on what you were saying. You nearly touched on it as well. You'd think the famine was a long time ago, but actually it's not as far away as you might think. My granny was born in around 1900, and it's possible. I had a relationship with her. I'm just saying in terms of generations.
Absolutely.
She could have easily been talking to someone that was living in the 1850s. So there's only one person between me and someone that was living in the famine times. It's not as far away as people might think.
Absolutely. Yeah, very, very good point,
And there is almost certainly a collective memory of those times, even if you're not thinking about it all.
Yeah.
It's there in the background.
Probably the collective memory isn't as strong as it should be because 3 million left. So most who stayed are the ones who were insulated financially from the famine, So it's interesting that a lot of us haven't the collective memory of the famine because our families, speaking personally, my family just was heavily insulated from it. We lived probably in a 2-storied farmhouse with windows and things like that. But it's you're dead right how recent it is. It is modern history.
It's not as far
Yeah.
away.
I missed 2 slides.
Oh yeah.
Have you time? Have you? Okay. Thanks very much. What's your name?
Ian.
Eddie, you're making me work tonight, Ian. Are you on the family, Ian? Are you on the Whelan's, no? You're just sandwiched between them?
Yeah.
Okay.
He's a dual man, I think.
What time's it, please?
20 to 10 or something.
Okay, we'll do the 2 slides. Very good. So, sorry, I in the interest of being objective about this emotive subject, one has to say that there was a response by the British government to the crisis. They did not interfere with the market, which is probably the resolution of the crisis, but they did come up with 2 schemes. And the first one was called a public works scheme, mostly building of roads, some walls, infrastructure projects, public, none of them benefiting any private landlord. A lot of them were useless infrastructurally, started nowhere and ended nowhere, but some of them were useful, like for example, the Corkscrew Hill between Ballyvaughan and Liston-Vernon. It took out a lot of time, and still does today, on your journey there. The sea walls in Kilkee is another one that comes to mind in Clare. Some of the projects were useful. The Healy Pass on the Burren Peninsula, another useful project, but most of them were useless. The idea of these public works schemes was, one, they did not interfere with the market, which they didn't because of public works. And the second thing was, the point of them was that the idea was people get money, they get paid for it, they buy food, and the problem is solved. This is the perfect solution. But as we know from history books, they were abject failures. One of the reasons was they were overwhelmed by proposals. There's 3 million people, and most of them are trying to get on these schemes. There's endless bureaucratic obstacles. The wages were slow coming through, and it's a cruel fact in famine anywhere in the world is, prices rise, prices of food rise, there's not supply down. And it laterally, rates were used to finance a scheme. These are rates from, essentially private citizens, wealthy citizens, and it must be easy to collect rates in famine times. You put all these together, they were abject failures, so much so that in June 47, the projects were abandoned. Now, one of them has been excavated, and that's in Boha, County Fermanagh. And they said it was community archaeology. It was done by Eileen Donnelly from Queen's University Belfast with a colleague of hers, whose name I forget. They've done brilliant stuff in unbaptised children's burial grounds. But he said it was a highly unusual archaeological project for 2 reasons. One is, they knew before they started digging the dates. the unit began in October 46 and finished June 47. Very useful when you're doing an archaeological dig. And secondly, they said they found nothing. They said, you know, they thought that's unusual in archaeological excavation, but perhaps because these people had nothing. They were bitterly resented then, and even now they're one of the most contentious legacies of the famine. That was a community archaeology scheme. It was a project, very interesting. It is the first famine relief road on the Isle of Ireland, which has been recorded as a national monument. So plenty of outcomes for it. There was a great event at the end of it when they were closing out, open air at the road. It was interdenominational, and you know, it was kind of many people attended, and it was community archaeology, cutting edge community archaeology there in Boha. That is the famine relief road at Culurty in Kilnaboy. I think it goes from Ashfield, which is next townland down, or what's Cartleck is the townland, but Ashfield is within the townland, and it kind of ends up at Culurty, but then the road goes on towards from Ashfield to where? Boston. Boston. Thank you. God. That was the road. It is unfinished. A lot of it's finished, but it is unfinished. And you can see there, it's a lot of loose stones. And one of the most, I'm fascinated by famine roads, but I'm particularly fascinated by the satellite archaeology at the side of it.
Yes.
On the roads. Because you can see all along this road, you can see small stones at the side. And these are bigger. And small stones are for what's called the binding. To bind into that to make the surface navigable is to go on, because it's very rough, it's not finished. And that obviously was finished June 47. And a lot of the smaller stones, banks, were left there unused. And it was a particularly fascinating couple of things on, again, satellite stuff off the road. There's two primitive shelters made of stone along the road. And of course, one of the things was that the stewards that worked on these roads were very well paid and sometimes quite connected, nepotism. And this is kind of even within this, you know, public works scheme, they have this kind of a highly inegalitarian thing going on. And there's two kind of stone shelters there, and they were perhaps built for the stewards but not the workers, you know, so that's interesting as well. That was taken by my friend Nick, mentioned him earlier, and we were out I was giving a walk to a couple of Canadian people, Australian people of Irish extraction, and we're on the road. Nick was taking a few photographs, and we got that. And it's an irony because, you know, the thing at the end of the rainbow, there's a pot of gold, and you know, you look at the road and you say, yeah, but not for everybody. Anyway, that was that. The last one then is oh yeah, sorry. Yeah. So the second thing they came up with was the workhouses. Now they started before the famine, and essentially an ill-conceived welfare system for the paupers, huge poverty each time. But by 1847, they moved into overdrive as stopgap response to famine. So public works scheme has failed, so they move on to the workhouses, and there's over 130 in Ireland. But again, these are abject failures. There's overcrowding, appalling conditions. The diet isn't good in them, poor medical care, and they have to work for their board and lodgings. 200,000 people died within them, you know, and these are places where lives were meant to be saved, you know, and there's mass graves within the grounds a lot of the time. That's the admission block of the one in Corofin village. Like, it's amazing, like, even how close us here, we're blessed if we want to have these prompts about our past still here. And that's the admission block, still surviving, but it would have been a much bigger affair. You go into the yard there, you would have had things like the infirmary, the mortuary, and you know, it's kind of a personal thing to me, but my sons, two sons are 18 and 14, and they play soccer in the cage for Corofin Harps, the local club, and it's in a green site down in the village there. Lovely place for athletics and soccer and that. And like all the years go down there, we park the cars roadside and look at the match from the road, and across the other side of the pitch there's a big high wall. And only the last couple of days when I was doing this realised that was the wall of the boundary wall of the workhouse. They didn't want anyone to come in, and they tried to get in, and it certainly didn't. It was kind of their prison-like affairs, you know. Yeah, that's the admission block in Corofin. It's schoolroom, porter's room, admission wards and boardroom. and with the good fortune that that is intact, at least the admission block, and it's owned by the HSE, but I think some local people are trying to get together an exciting initiative where it might be reimagined as artist studios, I think, like, you know, so, you know, hopefully something will come of that, you know, so you reminded me of it.
Tony, have you any data on or knowledge of the famine roads? Were they men, women equal amounts?
Yeah, no, what's the story there? That's a good one about the women and children. I'm not sure if it,
Well, the children's unlikely.
yeah, I'm not sure if the women worked in them.
It's
I'm
just
not-
the stones.
yeah,
When the stones get smaller, they get in other parts of the world. I still see it happening.
yeah,
They have a little hammer and they've a stone that, so they'd be breaking them into smaller stones.
yeah,
And you see the piles of them still.
yeah. No, they would have had tools, but they were very primitive, you know.
Mm.
And I know what you're talking about because my wife lived in Malawi, and we were walking that road
Yeah.
when we first came to live here in the Burren. She said, "You see those stones aside the road?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "You know what they are?" I said,
Same
"Don't."
thing.
She says, "Malawi, the kids today,
The kids
one of
do.
the poorest country in the world, they're breaking the stones aside the road.
Yeah.
A fella comes out with a quarry truck, he buys them off it for not much, and he sells it on a higher price. You've seen it yourself, so it's still
I
going on.
suspect it was probably the women that were doing
Yeah,
it.
perhaps. But the conditions in which they did this was like they're emaciated, they're starving, the work is very hard, the pay is not great, the conditions are atrocious. The winter of '46 was very rough, you know, and there's people dying on the roads. And there's the folklore of Irish famine relief roads is very interesting because even of that road Calorty in the school's collection, there's it's stated, one of the elders in this community is interviewed by a young school kid, and it said that a man called Doherty, I think it was, died on the road. Now, I don't know if a man did or not, but that is the folk belief. And they're considered kind of were by elderly people as eerie places that at night you could go by very quickly, and places which were kind of supernatural and paranormal. And that folk belief was really endorsing the view that these were kind of places, just possibly sad places with a grim history, you know. So that's that, you know. Any questions or comments?
You
Hello.
mentioned the rates used by to finance these roads. Who was financing these?
So initially they were financed out of the public purse, the Treasury in London, but then they changed it to get the ratepayers in Ireland to pay from their rates to finance the roads. You know, like rates, you have an Ennis, you collect rates from each individual. So yes, it's kind of like, you know, merchants, speculators, landowners, and you know, collecting rates at a time of famine when some of their estates are getting distressed. That was one of the reasons why they were a failure, because the burden of the finances of the schemes went to ratepayers in Ireland instead from the Treasury in Britain, like, you know. But it's just one of the reasons.
And the rates were they exorbitant?
I don't know that, but I know rates are hard to collect apparently at the best of times, but at a time of famine, even for these people who are moneyed, it's they're getting under the cosh bit financially as well. So it's kind of a, you know, it's the global answer is that, you know, the solution to the problem was export less food and access to starving people, but they did not, you know. So these were the two schemes that failed, you know.
One of the things that you mentioned there about Glenina, the graveyard in Glenina, it was abandoned afterwards because it was so many people
Really?
went into it. Yeah.
Yeah,
And there's a huge amount of potential in the headstones there, but over the last 30 years, a lot of it has been
overgrown.
overgrown.
Yeah, that's
But
where
there
the
is-
kind of medieval parish church is.
It's just before you come to the castle. It's just
Yeah.
there's
Down
a
the
bit down the
lane,
road there. My
yeah.
grandmother lived across the road there.
Go away.
And just down the road there.
Yeah.
And I think once I've ever seen a funeral going in there.
Yeah, yeah,
Whereas they go down to Ra now.
yeah, yeah.
That was the main reason.
Yeah, and if you do choose to make a donation, any money we get tonight will go to the Union of Agricultural Works Committee in Gaza, because there is identified as a famine situation in Gaza by United Nations. And the Union of Agricultural Works Committee, what they do in Gaza is trying to before the attacks happened in Gaza, what they were trying to do is food sovereignty for the farmers there, to be independent food-wise. But now, of course, it's a famine situation, and even worse, a lot of the farmland has been destroyed by the IDF as part of this project, inverted commas. Most of the olive trees have been cut down to deny them ever kind of even getting back to food independence again. So it's tough times for them. So if you do want to put a couple of bob in, it'll all go to that UAWS. Thanks for coming along.
Thank you.
Very much.